Well, thank you both very much, and I'd like to throw it open. Yes, please, sir. Yeah.
I have two questions.
I think a mic is just coming, Mr. Roberts. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions, and normally I like to throw out just one, but I want to be sure to posit both. One is, in terms of indicators, both of you gentlemen have mentioned that there are some out there, but I'm wondering in terms of more systematic, for example, the Human Development Index by UNDP. Has that proved to be efficacious, and or are there other systematic ongoing measures? Now that's on the indicators end. On the solutions end, my very different question is, Professor Wolff, you mentioned the remark, a reference to the US, but it could be anywhere, about transplanting entire, we'll call them, I'm interpreting and extrapolating what you said, we'll say institutional regimes and structures. I was involved with government for 30 years in strategic intelligence and in futures. But over the same period, in fact, going 45 years, I've been involved with volunteer organizations and have found, notwithstanding living in the United States and Canada, that working with citizens, working with volunteers, working with youth, how to proceed, solve problems, mount projects democratically is not necessarily reflexive. And I'm wondering whether or not either of you gentlemen have thought then that to preempt conflict without trying to transplant entire institutional regimes, there may be practices which need to be moved in, educating an elite, educating the local leaders, so that there are processes and mechanisms that can be given to them for mediation, seeking compromise, etc.
Yep. Do you want to take the first one?
Sure. I can take the indicators question. So it's a really interesting area. We know that there are a number of indicators out there. The Global Center is actually going to undertake a more sort of systematic analysis. To be very technical about it, the challenge is whether there's data that's disaggregated below the national level and across ethnic groups. So what I mean by that is understanding the percentage of the population that has access to a particular service doesn't really tell us what the distribution of that is within the society. And what we're really concerned about here is what's sometimes called persistent patterns of horizontal inequality. So horizontal inequality is inequality between groups on the basis of group identity. Vertical inequality is income inequality. And so the question that we still need to answer is across the very many dimensions of pluralism, just what's out there that allows us to capture these dynamics. And so we're engaged on that. And I think I will pass the second question to Stefan, but I'll just make one point, which is I think kind of there's some emerging research in the field of genocide prevention and atrocity prevention that suggests that practices of dispute resolution can be particularly important. The only thing I'd question is how we can bring them in. I think that may be useful in a sort of small time frame, but what the research is suggesting really is in terms of long-term resilience, we're talking about ways in which a society understands the way it manages conflict. And so some of the research I've seen suggests that in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, social attitudes about dealing with disputes have actually been quite useful in heading off a number of risk factors that are associated with atrocity crimes. But I'm then talking about much longer term practices, and so we may be looking at education and cultural change there as well. But
yeah, just to pick up on this last point, I very much agree with that. I mean, we need to find a better balance between strengthening local processes, but also adding some from the outside, not necessarily from our own cultures and communities, but also looking next door or looking into a completely different region. And what I found really useful as an approach, and at the same time frustrating with the sort of the demand side in peace negotiations, is that there's always a demand for just give me a system that we can use as a whole. So let's take the Constitution of France, or let's take the federal model of Germany or of Switzerland or of Canada. That's the wrong approach, because what the way I see it is you need to build this bottom up from the actual issues that you need to resolve. So the system in Belgium has grown out of very particular challenges, and they have come to a way which, with all its imperfections, they can actually live without a government for 1,000 days, and nobody realizes the difference because the system just works. Now, in Iraq, that's not possible. I mean, not having a government for 900 some odd days in Iraq, that's a real problem. So the way in which I would like the international community more generally to approach these situations, actually to think, okay, what are the issues that we have to resolve? And then think on an issue-by-issue basis, whether that's upstream prevention or crisis management or post-conflict peace building, to look at different options of how very similar problems have been addressed elsewhere. And then once you have a range of options on one issue and on another issue and on a third issue, then you need to think through which of these options actually work optimally together. Because it's also no good to have an electoral system that doesn't deliver sort of the proportion of people that you need to fill a mandatory power-sharing government. So you have to think through this in two stages, in a sense. But the idea of blueprints, I think it's very tempting, because a lot of these negotiations happen under pressure. There's very little local capacity often to really engage with very complex issues of institution building. So the pressure then is on experts from the outside. Give me a presidential system, or give me a way in which you can appoint the government under a semi-presidential system, or give me a judicial system, or a model of federalism, or something like that. But that, in the end, is very often counterproductive because it makes assumptions about societies that simply don't ring true to the people on the ground. But where I, as an expert, I mean, what do I know about Yemen other than stuff that I've read in books? So I can give you options, but somebody else then who actually knows the situation has to decide which of the options they really want.
Thank you. Ferry de Kerkhoff, then this gentleman in front, and Bob Blackburn over there, if you please.
Yeah, thank you.
Ferry, we've got a mic coming. So.
I didn't think I needed one. Okay. My name is Ferry de Kerkhoff, former Canadian diplomat. Of course, Patrick, you couldn't give the list of every institution contributing, but as a former Sherpa of Francophonie and engaged in Commonwealth, I was going to ask you to what extent that, the commitment of both institutions to conflict prevention, to all those things that you've mentioned, I thought, to what extent do they really complement usefully what is being done, or is there enough synergies between those institutions? The second one, very quickly, is about Egypt, in the sense that we've seen the Arab Spring, and to what extent centers like yours, John, or others, can pick up the ball, as it were, and do some support in transition, because we focus a lot on conflict, prevention, early warning, and all that. But when we see a golden opportunity of change, but which is clearly going to create explosion, which are going to backtrack and all that, to what extent is there something that can be done? And finally, when we talk about Syria, and we hear Mr. Kerry saying that we should be talking to Assad, is that something that institutions like Centers for the Global Centers and others can actually mediate so that it doesn't create a kind of horror reaction, even though we may think that it's necessary?
That's over to you, John.
Where to begin? But Ferry, I think your Egyptian, on the Commonwealth and the Francophonie, I leave that to Patrick, but Egypt, I think, is an interest. I think the whole Arab Spring cries out for an organization like this one to take a really hard look. And the way we were thinking of approaching it, and I'd be appreciative of your view, is to look at the most hopeful experience, Tunisia, and try and understand why in that society an Islamist party won the elections, but has taken a view that there should be no compulsion in religion, and has found a way to accommodate a parliamentary system, and so that the two Tunisias, the one more traditional, more religious, more conservative, more rural, has been reconciled with the urban, more secular. So what we thought was maybe we focus on that, bring Tunisians together to tell us why, and then engage in a dialogue in places like Egypt or Turkey or Algeria and say, look, here are some of the lessons, and see what was, so a kind of indirect approach, but that might suggest in societies that are similar but not the same. But what's the magic? What was the magic that has enabled this to go forward in Tunisia? I think for our center, what you're suggesting in terms of a role in an immediate crisis, I think that's not our niche. This is about bringing knowledge together and making it available to people perhaps at an earlier stage when there's receptivity. It's not a kind of intervening in crisis. I mean, I think that's not our place. Huh? No. No. So that's a short no. I mean, a long no. Yeah.
I mean, on the Commonwealth and Francophonie question, a couple of reflections. I mean, working in the UN, have strong relationships with both institutions, and I think here, standards for membership in international clubs are important, right? There needs to be, if you were to be a good standing member of Francophonie and Commonwealth, you shouldn't have serious patterns of exclusion in your society, and if you do, you should be willing to try to address them. And this is not an abstract issue. Sri Lanka was a huge issue for the Commonwealth over the last couple of years. And I think what's particularly important from a normative perspective, if you're trying to promote pluralism as a positive good, that's promoted at different levels. So at the global level in the UN, through regional organizations, through institutions like Commonwealth and Francophonie, what we can't have is forum shopping, where you can say, in New York at the UN, I'm all for pluralism, I'm combating exclusion, and then you go somewhere else and it's not quite an issue you have to deal with. So a couple of reflections on how they fit together.
Yeah. I think in the Commonwealth, it's also very important to have peer pressure.
Yeah.
I mean, if Her Majesty's government tells Zimbabwe that actually what they are doing is not so good, that gets everybody's backs up quite easily. But if actually Zimbabwe's neighbors that are members of the Commonwealth or not tell Mr. Mugabe, actually, no, that has to stop now, and you have to do X rather than Y, I think that's much more important. So I think in that sense, again, the added value of a pluralism lens is that it's much easier to subscribe to inclusion good, exclusion bad, than to necessarily subscribe to the Westminster model of democracy. So again, there's an intuitive attraction, I think, to use something like that and create a broader consensus, regardless necessarily of what your colonial histories and experiences have been, that would make it more difficult for individual countries to hide behind this is all a neo-colonial, neo-imperial attempt to impose whatever it is that they think is being imposed on them, and to say, no, this has really something to do with human dignity. And if we assume that human dignity is a value that we all can subscribe to, that is sort of applicable across the range of different religious beliefs, ethnicities, cultures, and so on and so forth, then it's much easier to use that kind of lens and generate broader pressure on those that try to do the kind of forum shopping that Patrick has referred to, and make the Commonwealth, in this case, a much more effective organization to actually help with the upstream prevention by having a commonly accepted norm that it's simply not okay to exclude 10, 20, 30% of your population from certain benefits or services.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Very patient gentleman in the front row, if you please. And then I have Bob Blackburn, Francois Brega, and Pegatha Taylor, and Rob Young.
Alain Michel Ayash. I have a question regarding exactly the Middle East. I'm a former citizenship judge and currently visiting scholar in Lebanon in particular, where I see that Lebanese society is an example to be taken into account. My question is, I agree with what you have said, that the tendencies in the West is to implement a model that is based on Western knowledge and Western know-how. However, the main problem is that these societies in the Middle East do not believe in citizenship, do not believe in the belonging, and rejecting everything related to Sykes-Picot. They accuse the West of being the one who created these entities, which is the main problem. My question to you is how to overcome this without bringing those societies to dialogue and to know each other better than they supposedly know themselves now.
I think the answer is in the question. I mean, it can only happen through dialogue. But how to do that, I think, is... I mean, it's difficult and it's not difficult. I mean, it's difficult for me to go there and tell them, you need to talk, or you need to talk in this particular way, or you need to talk with that particular person. I think in that sense, some of the challenge is to find local partners, credible local partners who can be part of this kind of pluralism dialogue that would then have greater credibility with other local actors. On the other hand, I also think that, I mean, and forgive me if I misinterpret what you said. I mean, for me, it's not about undoing Sykes-Picot. That is the solution to the problem. That may be a solution to one problem that creates a whole host of new problems that then somehow will have to be managed in a different way. So, I mean, my approach is try to find a solution to a problem rather than displace the problem. So I think from that perspective, I mean, I don't speak any Arabic, so I can't really speak to the fact of whether there's an equivalent concept of inclusion, exclusion, citizenship in the way that we see it here. But then I would also imagine that it's, I mean, in particular in a society like Lebanon, I mean, you have had a kind of national identity kind of sense that actually managed the relationships between the different communities more or less successfully, sort of take out a couple of decades where it didn't work so well. But, I mean, societies there also have found models of managing the pluralism challenges that they have had, some better than others. But again, I don't think there is necessarily a cultural predisposition in societies not to be able to deal with, let's call it pluralism, let's call it inclusion, exclusion. I think that's a similarly disastrous Western assumption than thinking that everything we do should just be replicated around the world, and then the world would be a better place.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Blackburn. Yeah. Here's a mic, Bob. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Bob Blackburn, as you figured out from what John said. Interesting, both speakers talking about the proliferation of indicators and even instruments and the academic analysis of what one might do about it. It's interesting to me that you haven't talked about how essential it is to find leaders to work with, and leaders at an early stage rather than the crisis stage. And to me, probably the best example in the last generation that we've seen is South Africa, where the existence of incredibly leaders with great foresight, great institutional and international pressure to facilitate the process, led to the development of a system that worked for 20 years. Now it's showing a lot of the fragmentation that you were talking about that exists elsewhere. So maybe it's time for the Global Center to find some very, very promising young South Africans and bring them to engage in a dialogue that, because the Zuma government and its corruption and where the ANC is going, I mean, it's on some bad paths right now. There's one that possibly, because it worked in the past, you might be able to do something for the future. Just a thought. I think leaders are something that you need to think about more. It's not just systems and indicators. You need very leaders with great foresight and some credibility in their cultures.
Bob, it's a hugely important point, and in trying to think through who are the audiences for the Global Center for Pluralism, we're delighted to have this great Ottawa audience. We have one online, but in terms of the people we're really targeting, it's really leaders in society, political, but also in civil society. And I think you're right to put the emphasis on young ones, people emerging, who can really affect change and who could use help from outside. So I think it's a huge point. Francois in the back.
Thank you. François Brégard. I agree with what Bob has said, but I'd like to go back to indicators. I haven't heard the speakers talk about the importance of environmental degradation or resource mismanagement as factors reducing economic opportunities for certain sectors of society. And I was wondering, is that because you think these are irrelevant or because we don't have appropriate indicators to measure them?
I can take that question. The first part, certainly not irrelevant. And I think, forms of exclusion are myriad and diverse, right? But one of the obvious ways in which particularly communities are excluded within societies is equitable access to resources or inequitable exposure to environmental degradation, and that's particularly true in some African states. So I think from a pluralism lens, what you're interested in is where patterns of discrimination or inequity fall along group lines, and that can involve everything. So I think the issues you raise are particularly pertinent. The indicators question, I don't know the answer to that yet, and that's one thing that we'll be looking into. Is I don't know whether we have the data that disaggregates that access by group, which is what we need to know to determine whether or not the particular kinds of exclusion that we're looking for are present. But I mean, we've talked a lot about politics, we've talked a lot about conflict, we've implicitly talked a lot about law, but economic livelihoods, basic social services, this is a huge piece of the puzzle as well. And one of the many ways in which groups are excluded is that they have inequitable access to the basic goods provided by a state.
Thank you, Patrick. Pegatha, if you please, up front, second row here now.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about sort of the relationship in a way between, I'm drawing an analogy in my mind from the concept of frozen conflicts to concept of kind of frozen pluralism. And also thinking about whether you approaches to encouraging pluralism through policy, that sometimes what you're talking about is top-down, sometimes what you've been talking about is top-down, sometimes what you've been talking about is bottom-up, social change and social habits. I know the Aga Khan Foundation actually has a lot of concrete experience on kind of approaching things both top-down and bottom-up. My question is, how do you deal with a state that pursues a form of pluralism or form of inclusion policy, but which only goes so far? And part of its articulation of that policy is around redistribution of resources, a certain baseline of equity, but that it partly justifies what it's doing, in fact, on grounds of conflict avoidance. But the level of actual genuine pluralism is to some extent superficial. There's a kind of a model from the old Soviet Union, but I think also of China, current day China, where there's a very statist approach to managing diversity, managing minorities, which includes a sort of a baseline of stability. How do you interact with a state that justifies only a certain degree of stagnation, let's say, in its approach to social inclusion and pluralism, on grounds, in fact, of conflict avoidance?
I think there's sort of intuitively, I would have two answers for that. One is that pluralism stagnation is, in fact, pluralism degradation, because I always see it as a very dynamic situation where you always need to think about sort of how you manage and maintain levels of pluralism, and that's an active project, a continuously ongoing project. It's not like you put a system in place and then it works forever and a day. I mean, that's kind of the Lebanon problem. I mean, they had the census in, I think, 1933, and then they didn't have another census until 1975 because
not even.
No, in 1975 the conflict started or something. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so I mean, you constantly need to work on it. So if you just sort of do a standstill model, then in fact you're sliding backwards. the other issue, I think, is that if you have a state, and I mean, China, not my regional expertise by any stretch of the imagination, but if you have a state that actually recognizes that a certain level of pluralism is helpful, then the argument that I would put to them is, well, actually, it's not harmful. Actually, it doesn't hurt you to include people. And maybe if you then sort of think 5 or 10 years ahead and you sort of model certain developments that if you keep it at that level, then where you'll be in 5 or 10 years is actually not at a place where you avoid conflict, but where you actually actively promote conditions that will create conflict. Then you can probably make a fairly sound case that would say, well, actually, let's try and go a little step further, sort of let's do a little bit more, but in a way that doesn't necessarily mean that you would construct it as a real challenge to the regime. So I mean, my other analogy would be the 1975 OSCE process. I mean, that was there was the third basket that was always seen as a little bit of an add-on, but it was also sort of a way of trying to take sort of the fear that communist regimes had, much as other regimes have today, that everything that comes from the West is something evil that undermines them, that will sort of destroy their deeply held beliefs. So I think from that perspective, there is something to be said about engagement that is non-threatening. And again, I keep coming back to that. Pluralism in that sense, or inclusion and exclusion, in my view, are less threatening as when you talk about you must have free and fair elections every 4 years. It's just not really worth always the risk of pushing what arguably is a good policy. It may have consequences in other parts of the world that are not as benign as a government change in the UK that might be coming up sometime soon, or not.
Thank you, Stefan. Rob Young, up this way, if you please. And then the gentleman in the front left, yeah.
Thanks so much. This is super stimulating. I'm Robert Young from the ICRC based here in Ottawa. Naturally, I'm going to say a few words about conflict. Obviously, early warning is not part of the ICRC's work and mandate, but it has tremendous implications for our work. I agree with everything you both have said about the importance of the machinery and resources going into it. I think I'd also agree with the way you diplomatically described the unrealized potential of a lot of these efforts. For the ICRC, we watch with great interest all these efforts. At the same time, a few months ago, we launched our biggest ever budget, which is maybe one indicator of how much all of this is working, that we expect to have more business in 2015 and 2016 than we ever had before, sadly. But in terms of indicators, I wanted to go back to your comment, Patrick, about the difficulty in mobilizing resources and attention for prevention. That's a huge challenge for the ICRC and all of the work that we do, trying to teach and disseminate IHL and so on. It seems to be one indicator about where we may have problems is where have you had conflict before? What the ICRC observes about conflict today is most of it is non-international, so civil wars within a society. Probably secondly, more and more it's ethnically or identity-based. And thirdly, it's persistent. It doesn't go away. It's like those birthday candles that you can't quite blow out. That's, Colombia, 40 years. Other contexts we can think of, 40, 50 years. It seems to me, I'd like your thoughts on this, for the Global Center and for the work being done academically and in terms of prevention, early warning, an easy set of contexts may be the ones where there's been recent violent conflict that makes it unequivocally clear that there is this grave deficit of sort of pluralism or respect for diversity. And those contexts where, I don't mean at the peace process stage, because usually the deals of peace processes tend to reinforce the power of leaders who have their power based on identity and ethnicity. But in the aftermath, maybe what's called reconstruction phase, rebuilding phase in UN terms, in the aftermath, there may be key moments. We find in the ICRC that the greatest attention, the greatest interest for consuming our advice about joining treaties, about implementing IHL treaties, international law, is a year or two after conflicts. 6 months after is too soon. 5 years later is too late. 2 or 3 years afterwards, people will engage. It strikes me there's a moment there that's a similar moment that for a discussion about pluralism and for the work of the center, that the sort of sweet spot of where one might engage and have an impact would be 2 or 3 years after most conflicts, before everything comes unraveled again, but with the realization that there's a high likelihood they might come unraveled again, unless somebody comes and doesn't give out package solutions. I agree entirely with your comments, but does bring in truckloads and truckloads of pluralism goggles and distributes them to key decision makers, current leaders, and the next generation. So your thoughts on that, maybe. Thanks.
So much to say. It's such an interesting set of issues. First, I'm sort of, you've made the case for prevention again in many ways when you talk about these persistent conflicts, and the reality is that it's much harder to rebuild than it is to address these issues before they fall into crisis. And what we're struggling with now is partly a symptom of our failure to prevent them in the first place. I agree that sometimes you need a crisis to change approaches, and that's true of societies as well. And conflict is crisis. It's no coincidence that in the post-conflict peace-building world, and also increasingly in the development world, we're talking about inclusiveness as a critical factor in successful rebuilding after states. And I think that dovetails very nicely with the adoption of a pluralism lens and to think more carefully about patterns of inclusion and exclusion. It's a time that holds a lot of promise. It's also really challenging. Tensions are particularly acute post-crisis, and not all settlements address those issues. In fact, most don't. And so then the final piece, which is something that the international community struggles with constantly, despite ample evidence indicating that it's needed, is sustained support. We know that rebuilding a society to a reasonable degree of stability after a serious crisis or after armed conflict is at least a 20-year process. We're talking generations, but yet we systematically diminish the investment halfway through that process. We change the way in which we engage. We declare success far too quickly, and then are surprised when 5 years later or 10 years later the country relapses. But it's a bit like the problem with prevention. We know better, but we haven't yet managed to adjust the way in which we deliver funding and the institutional mechanisms for engagement to reflect those policy realities.
Can I just make
one
footnote to that? We also need to be aware of the fact that inclusion does not automatically produce stability. There is, whether you do that sort of in terms of upstream prevention, very often what you're looking at is change. To be more inclusive, things have to change. And change is not always embraced by all those affected as a positive thing with great enthusiasm. And the same thing you have in the aftermath of civil war, peace agreement signed, whether it's 2 years, whether it's 5 years. The problem then is that actually in that sort of post-conflict phase, where inclusion is almost I shouldn't say in all cases, but in a lot of cases is mandated in the peace agreement, that does also not automatically lead to greater stability. So I think from that perspective, it's again about managing the process of inclusion becoming positively connotated, that actually people see the benefit, so that it's not you or me, you're in government and then my nephew can't be in government because you are taking his ministerial post or something like that, but rather the idea that sort of there is a greater public good that can be derived from having a more inclusive political process, more equitably, equally distributed economic opportunities, education, healthcare. All of those bread and butter issues that really make a difference in the aftermath of a civil war, of whether people see better prospects in keeping with maybe an unwelcome agreement, or whether they think, well, the agreement is so bad, we can just as well go back to war. So I think it's this really tricky issue of making inclusiveness or taking the instability edge out of policies aimed at inclusion.
Thank you, Stefan. I think the last question to this gentleman in the front, please.
Hi, my name is Peter. I'm from the Office of Religious Freedom here at the Department of Foreign Affairs. The office, as you might know, was established in 2013 with a mandate to promote pluralism in addition to protecting and advocating for religious minorities under threat and opposing religious hatred. So this is an excellent conversation. What's also quite interesting, I think, about the office is that we're located within the department, within the Political Affairs and International Security branch. And so, especially given the, explosion of the crisis in Iraq and Syria, we're being increasingly called on, I think, from a policy perspective, to take a look at the relationship between, religion, religious freedom, pluralism, and then stabilization, stability. So that's my main interest. My question is about pluralism as it relates to religious identity and religion. When we talk about pluralism, are all forms and manifestations of pluralism equally relevant from a conflict management perspective? Or is there something that's unique and salient about religious identity or religious community that impacts the politics of exclusion and inclusion?
Well, I mean, it's with many forms of identity, or at least with some forms of identity. I mean, it's very difficult to make a compromise there. I mean, you cannot be a member of two ethnic groups at the same time. You cannot believe in two religions at the same time. And with religion, I think the added problem, and I say that from the perspective of somebody who grew up in a society, East Germany, where religion was not exactly high on the agenda of what the party line was. So I think with religion, there's always a claim to having a universal truth. And if you have the truth, then the others don't have the truth. And then that takes sort of a whole spectrum of responses. Do you need to tolerate? Do you need to convert? Do you need to somehow get rid of the non-believers? So I think in that sense, there is an issue with religion that is potentially quite dangerous from a pluralism perspective. But at the same time, I don't think it necessarily should lead us down the path of saying, well, we should or should not tolerate certain religions. I think the challenge is to make sure that there is somehow a mode of coexistence that can be found where, even though they all believe in different gods and they have different interpretations of what is right and wrong to some extent, that need not necessarily lead to the kind of disastrous conflicts that we see in certain parts of the world that are where religion is used as a mobilizing factor, and where it's really not about the religion very often. It's much more about sort of individual, personal agendas, where religion sort of is a short form for just identifying easily manageable power bases, really. So I have no idea whether that is in any way a question. An answer to the question that you have posed. But personally, I think a conflict is a conflict, and there are certain things that you should or shouldn't be doing. And only in a second stage, then, is it really relevant what sort of the superficial layer is, or sort of the superficial issues are that the conflict is fought over. I think there's a certain common sense that you can apply. That's not that different whether it's an ethnic conflict, a religious conflict, a resource conflict, and so on.